And a very good evening to you all. My name is Anthony Murphy. This is Mythical Ireland. You're all very welcome. And just to explain, this is a live broadcast, or a webcast if you prefer, in which I talk about mythology and legends, a bit of storytelling, maybe a little bit of archaeology thrown in from ancient Ireland. The reason I started doing this was to try and provide some sort of a distraction with the current crisis that's going on in the world. That crisis has developed and escalated, and many of you may be under some sort of restrictions. If not, you're totally locked down. I'm hoping that during this series of broadcasts that I can help distract you from that, and if nothing else, provide you with a little bit of entertainment. So today is March the 18th. It's the day after St. Patrick's Day. For the first time in living memory, for the first time ever, in fact, we had St. Patrick's Day with no St. Patrick's Day parades. Some people who respected social distancing had their own little mini parades in various parts and their own little celebrations. But we saw nothing of the large gatherings of crowds that we would normally associate with St. Patrick's Day, unfortunately. So it's been a very unusual time, and it's going to continue to be an unusual time for a while. Let's hope that long after this crisis is over, we'll be looking back at this and say, remember that time when we had the crisis with the pandemic, and remember that we started doing these things, and maybe some of them will continue long afterwards. Today, the day after St. Patrick's Day, is Saint Sheelah's Day, allegedly, or at least it has been rescued from the mists of time that once upon a time the Irish celebrated March the 18th as Sheelah's Day. This is a tradition, we're going to read about that now, but this is a tradition that seems to have largely died out with the famine, and doesn't seem to have been resuscitated again until now. Free to drop in, mention where you are, and if you have any questions or comments, please make them. I'll try to keep up with them as we go along. I see Jacqueline Kennedy is there. Jacqueline, a very good evening to you, and nice to talk to you again. I think you're one of the people who's probably been watching every single one of these, so one of the regulars, as they say. Vicky Wallace-Southall is in from Oregon as well, and it's okay, so we had a bit of a problem there. Hope you're back with us. The wireless connection wasn't good, so I'm going to try to go with the mobile phone network connection, the 4G. So perhaps if everybody can hear me well, we'll start. Maybe if somebody just wants to say yes, everything's okay now, because I can't see a replay, as it were. So we'll get going. Which one is which? Which one am I starting with? Which one am I starting with? I can't remember. Anthony, get your act together. Live TV, huh? Yes. While the population... Good. Kirsten Salisbury says, yes, I can hear you. Good, good, good. Very, very sorry for the brief interruption. While the whole population of Ireland and people of Irish descent around the world celebrated St. Patrick's Day yesterday, not many people will know that the day after, March the 18th, is dedicated to St. Patrick's wife, Sheila. Yes, I know, it's shocking. St. Patrick was married according to tradition. Jules Cousins is in. Hello, Jules, one of the regulars. Oh, they're flying in here. Maria Mahan, looking forward to seeing you all day for your podcast. Good stuff, Maria. Jacqueline says, all good, and hello again. Judy McQueen, I can see and hear you. Good, good, good. Matthew Byrne is watching. Hello, Matt. How are you? The revelation that St. Patrick had a wife whose name was Sheila is tremendously exciting for a number of reasons. Shane Lahan, a folklorist from University College Cork, has discovered pre-famine references to a widespread belief that St. Patrick had a wife, and that Saint Sheelah's Day was celebrated the day after St. Patrick's Day, on March the 18th. Lahan was quoted in the Irish Times as saying, Karen Smith is in, says all okay here. Hello Karen, happy Saint Sheelah's Day. Lahan was quoted in the Irish Times as saying, pre-famine, if you go back to the newspapers in Ireland, they talk not just about Patrick's Day, but also Sheelah's Day. I came across numerous references that Sheila was thought to be Patrick's wife. Nancy Earhart says, hello from Canada. I haven't seen you in a while, Nancy. I hope you're keeping well. And Judy Dolliver Astley is watching in Ferndale in Michigan. Hello to you. Pre-famine, if you go back to the newspapers in Ireland, they talk not just about Patrick's Day, but also Sheelah's Day. I came across numerous references that Sheila was thought to be Patrick's wife. The fact that we have Patrick and Sheila should be no surprise, because that duality, that union of male and female together, is one of the strongest images that we have in our mythology, and maybe we'll have a chance to discuss more about that, which is very interesting. It's even interesting that newspapers recorded these traditions. When I was editor of the Dundalk Democrat, I had the pleasure of going through the old archives, and in the 19th century editions of the Democrat, quite often there were tracts of mythology and folklore and old songs. And in fact, one of my friends, hi Kieran, happy Saint Sheelah's Day to you. One of my friends, can I see it now? Yes, Pádraigín Niúlacháin, who's a musician, wrote this fabulous book called People, Songs and Traditions of Oriel, and a great deal of material for that was extracted from old issues of the Dundalk Democrat newspaper. So the old newspapers, certainly in the 19th century and even the early 20th century, used to record a lot of folklore and mythology. Erin Durrett, hello Erin, very good to see you. And you're in Seattle, isn't it? In the Pacific Northwest. Jacqueline Kennedy is calling in her friends to watch. Very good, thank you for that. Anyway, now we get on to talking about the Great Famine. Sheila, the way it's spelled here is Sheelah. But like a lot of names and Irish place names and personal names, there are probably numerous ways of spelling it. Although the devastating effects of the Great Famine on Irish culture might never be fully quantified, we have a significant example here of a folk belief that seems to have died out in Ireland with the famine. Anthony Woods is watching. Hello, Anthony. References to Sheelah's Day were found in the Freeman's Journal of 1785, 1811 and 1841, but the feast day has been, quote, largely forgotten about in Ireland, unquote, according to Lahan. Some time ago, I wrote about the story of the twining branches. This is me now talking, not Shane Lahan. Some time ago, I wrote about the story of the twining branches from the tale of Deirdre and the children of Equinox. Now, we will retell that story in another episode. And how memories of this creation myth were brought by Irish emigrants to Nova Scotia. The story of Sheila seems to follow a similar fate. Before the famine, which happened in the late 1840s, the celebration of St. Patrick's Day continued into March 18th for his wife's special day, Saint Sheelah's Day. And of course, in typical Irish fashion, copious amounts of alcohol were consumed. However, after the famine, the tradition seems to have died out here. But Irish migrants who ended up in places such as Newfoundland, Canada and Australia brought the tradition with them. Lahan says perhaps the most enduring legacy of Sheila is the so-called Sheila's brush. This is the name given by Newfoundlanders and Atlantic Canadians to a winter snowstorm that falls after St. Patrick's Day, sometimes referred to as Sheila's broom, or if the snowstorm is mild with only a bare covering of snow, Sheila's brush. It is still referred to respectfully by meteorologists and fishermen in that part of the world. Undoubtedly, some media commentators will pick up on the obvious relevance of Patrick's wife to the whole discourse about Catholic celibacy. and the perceived connection between that peculiar diktat of the traditional church here and the many sex and paedophile scandals that have decimated the Catholic faith here in Ireland. And that's something I do not want to go into in great depth here. Just suffice to say, I just added it in there. The Hill of Slane is strongly associated with St. Patrick, as we saw yesterday in the story of how he lit the Paschal fire there in contravention of the laws set down by the High King Lera at Tara. But there is no mention here of Saint Sheelah, his wife. A somewhat obscure and tenuous but perhaps very important connection is made by Lehan between Saint Sheelah and the hugely interesting archaeological manifestation that also bears her name, the Sheila-na-gig. Now, this comes with a little bit of a health warning, or not a health, probably a bad turn of phrase, a little bit of a disclaimer that we are going to be talking momentarily about rude stone carvings of naked females. So if that's not your thing, I urge you to switch off now and maybe come back tomorrow when we're talking about other things. A very good question, Aaron. Does Patrick ever refer to her in his Confessio? I don't believe so, and I think in fact that this is a vernacular folk tradition about Patrick that the church wouldn't be all too happy about. And we'll delve into the reasons, I think, or some of the possible reasons that Patrick is said to have had a wife. Sheila-na-gig is a basic medieval carving of a woman exposing her genitalia. These images are often considered to be quite grotesque. They are quite shocking when you see them first. Now we look at them very much as examples of old women showing young women how to give birth. They are vernacular folk deities associated with pregnancy and birth. And Lehan believes that the tradition of Sheila could and should be revived and embraced in Ireland. Sheila represented, for women in particular, a go-to person because she represented the female. The Sheila-na-gig is a really important part of medieval folk tradition. She is an important folk deity. And these are Lehan's words. The figure of Sheila was perhaps much bigger than suggested by the scant mentions we find in the old newspaper accounts. She would have been massively important. She represents a folk personification allied to what can be termed the female cosmic agency, and being such, would have played a major role in people's everyday lives. It is a pity that the day has died out, but maybe we will revive it. In relation to the revival and the reactivation of Sheila, my own view is that the revival of the tradition of a female deity equal in status to Patrick might very well be important to the spiritual well-being of a country which has been very heavily influenced by patriarchal religious zeal for centuries, an influence that is seen by some as a contributory factor in many of Ireland's ills. Karen says she was just about to ask about the Sheila-na-gig, so people are making the connection automatically, which is very interesting, you know. Margaret Ring says Sheila-na-gig on many early churches in the UK and Ireland. Yes, absolutely right, and we'll be getting on to discussing that. The symbolic importance of Patrick, who was, ironically, a Romano-British immigrant to these shores, cannot be understated in the milieu of a nation defined for so long by its trenchant support for the male-dominated Roman Church. Now we have the chance to reconcile the tradition of an almost forgotten woman into the complex folk fabric of her fractured cultural history. A history that, it must be borne in mind, was vibrantly aware of the necessity for accessibility to the feminine deity in most of its past eras. Philip Murray is watching from Santa Maria in California. Hi, Philip. Very good morning. No, it's afternoon there too, isn't it? Very good afternoon to you. It's 8:15 here in Ireland. The patriarchal influence of Rome did not decimate the ancient divine feminine. Rather, it forced upon us some sort of collective obeisance to the supremacy of the omniscient and jealous male god of the Old Testament, forcing the old indigenous female deities such as the Cailleach and Sheila into the shadows. There was suspicion, this is a quote, there was, quote, suspicion and even hostility to the feminine, which many leading Christian thinkers and writers expressed in the early medieval period, unquote, according to Gearóid Ó Cruach in the Book of the Cailleach, a wonderful, wonderful scholarly, comprehensive work about the Cailleach. Aaron Durrett says the Irish Church could be a real leader in this. What a gift. Yeah, absolutely. The female wasn't altogether banished, but rather was revealed in a guise that was somewhat familiar, with reflections of the ancient goddesses of old, but very much dressed in the raiment of a woman whose power was contingent upon the emanations of the Catholic patriarchy. Thus, Brigid, the prehistoric goddess, survived as the saint who became known to us as Mura na Nail, the Mary of the Irish. And indeed, the Catholic Church had allowed Mary to become a co-redemptrix with Jesus. The presence of this ancient goddess, albeit in diluted form, in the Church of Rome was probably one of the factors that had helped the Church to become established in the first place. Jacqueline Kennedy says, the rise of the divine feminine has begun. Move over, Patrick. I have some thoughts about that. I agree to an extent, but this should not be about the domination of one gender. It should be about the equality of both, shouldn't it? Further to the potential revival of the tradition of Sheila here is the possibility that incorporating her into our national celebrations could become a hugely significant act. We have here the very vivid and exciting possibility of activating or reactivating a feminine energy that is, as C.G. Jung might have suggested, of supreme importance for the ultimate rehabilitation of the modern human soul through the reconciliation of the masculine and feminine elements in life. So there you go, that's the balance I was just talking about. Can one yet countenance the notion of a St. Patrick's Day and a Saint Sheelah's Day, a national holiday for Ireland spanning 2 days, recognising the male and the female, and allowing both to hold equal court in the hearts and minds of Irish people and their descendants and friends all around the world? Interesting possibility. One of the ironies of the story about the disappearance of Sheila from popular folk memory is that she hasn't vanished at all. The Sheila tradition simply moved abroad with the forced migrations resulting from mass starvation. Many of those who stayed behind perished. Sheila's story might have perished with the famine also, even if Patrick's story only became more ubiquitous, except for the fact that her flame was kept burning abroad in distant lands by those who left these shores. Emer Stassen is in. Hi Emer, how are you? Very much enjoyed our St. Patrick's morning conversation, and for those of you who are interested, Emer and myself had a conversation that could have spanned several hours, which is on YouTube. If you scroll down the page, you'll see it there yesterday. Oh, of course, my broadband is acting up, just as I need it to, because I was just trying to get the exact title. Being Celtic Podcast, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Times. So maybe when you're finished watching this, you can watch that. We were talking about the fact that Sheila's story would have disappeared except for it was brought abroad with the migratory exit from Ireland. The supreme irony is that Patrick, who was, according to folk tradition, married, brought the tradition of Jesus to these shores from a distant land, and that even though that tradition eventually transmogrified so that it espoused celibacy for its all-male clergy, Patrick himself had a wife. It could only happen in Ireland. So, following on that, that story appeared about 2 years ago at this time of the year. Following that, last year I wrote a blog post, which I'm going to read from, in which I visited a local Sheila-na-gig. So some of this repeats what we were just talking about, so forgive the repetition, but obviously there's new material there as well. So I just wanted to kind of bring you up to speed with the story of Sheila in case you're not aware of it. Yeah, Emer says, love that, I never knew Patrick had a wife according to popular folk tradition. This is something that's not recorded in the official stories of his life. But of course, we said yesterday, didn't we also, somebody said they'd love to read the story of St. Patrick from the point of view of the Druids, because we said that history is written by the victor, and the victor writes a slanted, one-sided, biased version of what happened. A pre-famine tradition that the 18th of March was a feast day in honour of a long-forgotten saint, Saint Sheelah, a wife or consort of St. Patrick, has come back into public consciousness due to recent scholarly work by Shane of University College Cork around the folklore of this event. To celebrate and remember Saint Sheelah's Day, I visited an obscure possible remnant of the tradition around this forgotten female figure. In 2018, Shane Lahan cast new light on an obscure and almost completely forgotten aspect of Irish folk belief. In short, he revealed that in pre-famine Ireland, March the 18th was dedicated to Saint Sheelah, and that Sheila was thought to have been St. Patrick's wife. The festivities around St. Patrick's Day on March 17th were continued into the next day in honour of Saint Sheelah. Newspaper reports predating the Great Famine, which occurred in the late 1840s, refer to this celebration. Recently, Drogheda community historian Brendan Matthews, based at Millmount Museum, came across reference to St. Sheelah's Day celebrations in Meath, and Brendan is a good friend of mine and has been researching the history and the folklore and the mythology of this region for many, many years. A very knowledgeable individual. An obituary for the infamous local highwayman Michael Collier, known popularly as Collier the Robber, carried in the Drogheda Argus newspaper in 1813, recorded the following. Some of the inhabitants of Stamullen, who were celebrating St. Sheelah's Day by indulging in large amounts of whisky, when the then parish priest of Stamullen, Father Ennis, went and broke up what he termed as, quote, a pagan indulgence, unquote. Matthews says that among the folk celebrating St. Sheelah in the old village of Stamullen that day was Collier the Robber. A few short words were exchanged between Father Ennis and Collier, whereby the priest informed the infamous highwayman, quote, that he would be better off clearing out of Stamullen and from this illegal drinking den, as the military were not too far off in search of him, unquote. And typical of the stories of the time, a great folklore grew up around Collier the Robber, and perhaps I'll get the chance in a podcast interview with Brendan someday to talk about that, to discuss Collier the Robber, who used to rob from the rich and give to the poor on the highways and byways of the area. Karen Smith says the ancient female goddess was held in the highest regard within pagan tradition way before Patrick. Absolutely correct, Karen. And I don't even use the word pagan, because pagan is a derogatory term, I believe, used by the church to describe anything pre-Christian. I refer to these traditions as pre-Christian or prehistoric. And of course they go all the way back into the Neolithic. Absolutely right. Lahan says that there was far more to Sheila than the once widely held belief that she was our national saint's other half. One of the reasons St. Patrick's Day is associated with drinking is because it always falls during Lent, and offered dispensation to disregard abstinence for the day. This dispensation in honour of St. Patrick was extended, says Lahan, into the next day in honour of his so-called wife. Sheila, as an old woman, is strongly resonant of the important Irish folk figure known as, I know some of you are saying it there before I say it. Go on, type it in as a comment. Who am I talking about? Finish this sentence. Come on, you students of mythology. Sheila, as an old woman, is strongly resonant of the important Irish folk figure known as the blank, Lahan points out. I'm waiting for someone to say it. Kieran, in the meantime, wants to know, what's your view on both festivals of St. Patrick and Sheila's tying in with the vernal equinox? Well, I don't think it's coincidence. It's a very significant event. Patrick comes from the east, lands at Inverculpa, heads to Slane, which is basically due west to the direction of the equinox sunset at the time of March. Yes, Aaron says Cailleach, and Nancy Erhard says Cailleach. We've got it. Hey, you took your time. Or maybe there's a bit of a lag between the video getting transmitted and you being able to type. That's fair enough. But we may talk more about that, Kieran, so remind me later to go back to the equinox. Julianne Osborne is watching. Hello, Julianne, and happy Saint Sheelah's Day to you. Yes, so we're talking about the Irish folk figure known as the Cailleach. Margaret Ring just said it there as I said it. Irish mythological, historical and folkloric expressions cast her as the expression... Anthony, that's repetition. How can you put expressions and expression in the same sentence? Do you not sub-edit and proofread your own copy, you fool? Cast her as the expression of the territorial and tribal sovereignty queen, and as of the life force inherent in nature, nurturing and maternal, but also terrifying and destructive. And Sheila Hawkins is in. Hello, Sheila. Saint Sheelah's Day being celebrated by Sheila Hawkins, whose name is Sheila. Jules Cousins is also here and says the Cailleach. Yep, 100%. The Cailleach's deep roots in the notions of birth, fertility and death brings to mind the Sheila-na-gigs, mysterious and often misunderstood medieval stone carvings. And yet again, I will warn you that we are about to talk about naked women with their genitalia on display. If you find that subject matter a little bit sensitive, then feel free to tune out now. There are over 100 known examples in Ireland. They're often found on medieval tower houses, medieval church sites and holy wells. I was delighted last year to have been asked to participate in and contribute material to a temporary exhibition, this is me, at Millmount Museum for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, especially as this exhibition focused on the Saint Sheelah's Day customs too. Yes, Margaret Ring is also commenting that this conversation is happening near spring equinox, the balance of sun and moon, day and night. That's a discussion. Please remind me, Kieran and Margaret, to come back to that just in a little while. The Sheila-na-gig at John Street, that's John Street in Drogheda, my hometown here, before its removal in advance, was pictured in a blog post. So I'll maybe link that blog post in after the discussion in the comments so that you can have a look at the pictures. The celebrations attracted a lot of visitors on St. Patrick's Day. This is last year, unfortunately not this year. But I made sure to make time to visit Drogheda's own Sheila-na-gig, which was removed from the wall of a house in John Street, number 18, which was demolished in advance of the construction of a new dual carriageway through the old heart of Drogheda back in 1976. Liam McLaughlin says, it must be said that priest must have been a brave man to stand up to Collier. Yeah, absolutely right. By the way, I recently, just as an aside, I recently purchased... I'm so glad now. I went on an absolute spending spree lately buying second-hand books. And I'm really glad. It was as if something in me knew I was going to be indoors for a while. And I needed reading material. I bought a book about newspapers published in the 1980s by Hugh Oram. And in it he said that in its earliest days, the Drogheda Argus was actually a newspaper that was run by Protestants and had a very sort of pro... British Empire and perhaps derogatory view of Irish nationalism, but it was sold and later taken over, and the new owners were much more favourably disposed towards nationalism. I'm just wondering, in relation to the story about Collier being accosted by the priest, whether there wasn't some exaggeration in there perhaps. Anyway, just a thought. Sheila-na-gigs are carved female figures, often featuring a woman hunkered or with her legs splayed and with her genitalia exposed, regularly in an exaggerated and grotesque way. Lehan says the women in them, who are reclining or squatting, often have big ears, long hair, gritted teeth, emaciated ribs and prominent breasts. In his book, Island of the Sheila-na-gigs, and we're going to get talking about Jack Roberts shortly. Jack Roberts says that they are carvings of naked females posing in a manner that is usually described as exhibiting themselves, and are often described or called obscene images. So it is rather surprising that they are found on churches and other religious structures. The National Monuments Service database of monuments suggests that the Sheela-na-gig of John Street is thought originally to have come from the Priory of St John here along the banks of the Boyne River in Drogheda. Here is the National Monuments Service description of it from the Sites and Monuments record, which appears to have been derived from Barbara Freitag's 2004 book Sheila-na-gigs, Unravelling an Enigma. It consists of a figure carved in high relief on a block of sandstone and quite weathered. Behind head of figure, 3 contiguous hollow ovals, large necklace head, 2 irregular depressions for eyes, no nose, mouth indicated by slit, no breasts, necklace with pendant pointing at long, narrow slit indicating vulva, arms in front of body with hands touching vulva and deep touch hole underneath. So again, if you want to have a look afterwards at the Mythical Ireland blog, there are pictures of the Sheila-na-gig. And actually I have pictures also, I should mention, of the Sheila-na-gig that was once displayed on the wall of the old mill house at Rossnaree, again on the south bank of the Boyne, close to Newgrange. That was taken from the wall and taken into the house for safekeeping by the owners, George and Barbara Heiss, who very, very generously allowed me into their home a few years ago to have a look at it and take pictures of it. There's a separate blog post about that, so I'll post links to all those when we're finished. Lehane says that many references made Sheila a byword for a bedraggled old woman. But, he rightly points out, elderly women also had experience of the world and were custodians of inherited knowledge, playing significant roles in rites of passage in the human life cycle and the cycle of the year. Very well put, Mr. Lehane. It is significant, in Lehane's view, that the festive time of Saints Patrick and Sheila coincides with the spring equinox. There we go. In a season of new fertility, when days are poised to outlast nights for the first time since the autumn equinox. And Erin Durrett says, perfectly appropriate, the divine female and the process of birth belongs in every sacred place. Well said. Margaret Ring says, no worries, Anthony, we are very proud of our wombs. Very good. Most Irish festivals, which include fairs, pattern days and wakes, took place over 3 days. The gathering, the feast and the scattering. Sheila's Day was the last, but not the least, of the traditional 3 days of celebration that began on the eve of St. Patrick's Day. Sheila, along with other holy women, such as St. Bridget and St. Gobnet, usher in a new cycle of fertility with ploughing, sowing, the birth of animals, the rising of the sap, and the reawakening of nature. Beautifully put. This was also a time of year that brought an emphasis on human marriage and reproduction, according to Lehane. Shrove Tuesday, which is immediately before Lent, has long been the most popular day in Ireland to be married. Sadly, the traditions around Saint Sheelah and her festival day seem to have largely faded into obscurity at the time of the Great Famine. Vestiges of these traditions survive among Irish emigrants in Newfoundland. Thankfully, through the work of people such as Shane Lehane, Barbara Freitag and others, Sheila is, hopefully, undergoing a resuscitation, a revivification. I discussed the cultural and spiritual importance of this in a previous blog 2 years ago. Again, I'll link all these in at the end. I cannot but agree with Lehane's closing remarks in his Irish Times article about Sheila when he says, as many of her devotees died in the famine, and given the influence of the misogynist patriarchal church, she has all but vanished from Irish life. I, for one, will be raising a glass to her on her feast day. And just in case you were wondering, the drink of choice, according to the traditions, would be whiskey. To Sheila, a toast to your restoration. In this case, it's a glass of water, but we'll try a whiskey later on. With regards to Sheila-na-gigs, I have to be honest, I'm not a scholar in this realm. There is one allegedly carved into one of the standing stones in the churchyard at the Hill of Tara, which features as the graphic that I used to promote today's live Irish Myths and Legends broadcast. And it's an interesting one because it may not exactly be representative of, you know, the other similar carvings. Anyway, I do not have a copy of Barbara Freitag's book. She is a renowned scholar and expert on Sheila-na-gigs, but I have some of the books by Jack Roberts, who's a friend of mine and another expert on Sheila-na-gigs. Emer Stassen says, I'm raising my cuppa to Sheila. Everybody should do the same thing. Aaron Durrett says, the rebirth of the goddess of birth. Now there is hope for our times. Well, I do think it's interesting that for the first time in living memory, that not only were there no parades in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day, but the pubs were closed. It's interesting, you know, it's coincidental, I know, but it's interesting nonetheless. One book that I would recommend if you want to delve more into the area is the Sheila-na-gigs of Ireland and Britain, the Divine Hag of the Ancient Celts, an illustrated guide, and that's by Joanne McMahon and Jack Roberts. Now, Jack has further updated his work and research in relation to the Sheila-na-gigs, and recently published, is this last year or the year before? It's either 2018 or 2019. Yes, 2018, Bandia Publishing and Design. Island of the Sheila-na-gigs, an illustrated guide by Jack Roberts. Now, Jack tells me, and I want to say this before I start, that this book is available on Amazon UK under a different title. And so the title is Sacred Celtic Images of Divine Femininity by Jack Roberts. So that's the term that you have to look for. And again, I will try to post in the link as a comment at the end of the broadcast. So there's a couple of sections that I just wanted to read. It's not directly connected with Saint Sheelah, but the connection has already been implied by Lahan. The mysterious name. Various attempts have been made to translate the curious name that those early antiquarians recorded, with most Irish dictionaries giving the rendering as Sheila-na-gigs, meaning literally Sheila of the breasts, from the Irish word goig, meaning breasts or paps. Why Bord Gaelga, or whoever decided on the translation for the official Irish dictionary, is open to speculation. It was, after all, an Irish word, at least as far as O'Donovan, one of the greatest Gaelic scholars, was concerned, and that's John O'Donovan, who travelled the length and breadth of Ireland, recording place names and stories about them for the Ordnance Survey in the 1830s, I think. It is, however, clearly inappropriate. So it was obviously not translated, but just rendered more palatable. It is, however, clearly inappropriate and entirely inapplicable to almost all of the known figures, few of which have any indication of breasts, or those that are small and quite insignificant. The truth is that no one knows quite what the name means, but it was definitely something very close to the words, as written by O'Donovan and other very early scholars, and rather than being in need of translating, is merely in need of understanding. Wow, very well said, Jack. Sheila, that's S-H-E-E-L-A, or Sheila in Irish, S-I-F-A-L-E, means femininity, but it also means a special kind of woman, a cailleach, hag, or spiritual woman. The word for a spirit or fairy in Irish is she, S-I-F-A-D-H-E, pronounced S-H-E-E, as in banshee, and means female spirit. So the first part of the name is quite easily understood, and is also a clear indication that by being invested with this title, they were regarded as spiritual images. And I'm very glad to tell you that I contacted Jack today, and that he gave me permission to read a couple of excerpts from his wonderful book. It is the second part of the name that leads to confusion and some disagreement. The word gig is usually interpreted as giach or giob, meaning the breasts or the buttocks, but it could equally be related to such words as gui, to pray, or even to dance, the jig. On many occasions it has been suggested that it was either a very localised nickname, even an unfortunate linguistic error, or a phrase of little specific relevance. One sceptical critic even suggested that it was a trifling and accidental circumstance that Mr. Coles just happened to meet an ununiformed man who trotted out the name from ignorance when questioned about the figures. Ill-judged ideas on the meaning of the name were a regular occurrence during the latter half of the 1800s and early 20th century, and it was not until Edith Guest and her colleagues made long inquiries into the origination and validity of the name that there was any kind of informed consideration applied to the subject. After visiting many of the figures and questioning country people from different areas, they found that although the name Sheila-na-gig was not commonly known in all areas of Ireland, it was most certainly recognised outside the confines of Tipperary or the South Midlands. The earliest instance or use of the name is in 1781, when it was recorded that a frigate was bought by the British Navy and that her name was Sheila-na-gig. There was even a record of the meaning of the name, which was explained as an Irish female sprite. In his much acclaimed Irish dictionary, Reverend Patrick Dineen translates the word Sheila as Julia and suggests giddy must be a translation of the word Giab, also spelt as Gogaide, which means a giddy person, a feeble old woman, a midwife, also the hunkers. Anderson suggested that this last interpretation makes sense for the majority of the Sheela-na-gigs that are often on their hunkers or squatting, but is not an accurate description for many others that are either standing or are in reclining positions. A small but often overlooked aspect of the Irish rendering of the name is the use of na, the genitive of the definitive article. Sheila-na-gigs translates as Sheila of the Paps, whereas in the first two forms of its spelling by O'Donovan, he uses Sheila-na-gig, which suggests a person's title. Ni, as the feminine genitive, means daughter of, and is most commonly used in surnames of females that begin with O. For example, Nuala O'Brien would be Nuala Nivrian. This is confirmed by the Sheila-na-gig from Cullahill Castle in County Laois that was known locally as Sheila-na-gigs or Gillian O'Dwyer. She was the head of the clan and was said to have been a bit of a tyrant. Gillian is derived from Julia, and the name should properly be spelt Sheila-na-gigs, N-I-G-U-I-R-A. This use of the name also suggests that the Sheila-na-gigs represent a local ancestor whose powers were of benefit to certain clans or who otherwise had an important territorial function. Now, I'm not going too deeply into Sheila-na-gigs because I absolutely recommend you get Jack's book. So I'm not entirely sure whether his website is Bandia Design. That's BANDIA design.com. And as I said, the other version of this book is Sacred Celtic Images of Divine Femininity. But I just wanted to very briefly dip into some of the traditions and popular beliefs around the Sheila from Jack's excellent book. In the Gaelic/Celtic world, the Sheila-na-gigs are invariably the only decoration of any significance to be seen on the church or building they adorn, and almost always set in a clearly visible and prominent position, such as the doorway, and there's a long-standing association in scholarly studies between Sheila-na-gigs and churches from the Norman era. This indicates that they were obviously not mysterious arcane objects, but something that was universally recognisable and understood, i.e. the fact that they were clearly visible on church walls. In her book, Sheila-na-gigs, Unravelling an Enigma, Barbara Freitag places the figures in a commonly comprehensible position amongst local community and states unequivocally that, quote, there are plenty of indications that Sheila-na-gigs belong to the ordinary people and rural traditions, unquote. If the local rural people knew what they were, then there would surely have been little mystery or ambiguity about their meaning. And I wonder about that and how much of that rings true, and certainly in terms of the Ordnance Survey letters, for instance, when O'Donovan and his friends, his colleagues, had the habit of approaching local constables and priests and, people who were perhaps a little bit detached from that local vernacular community, or who perhaps didn't share in its traditions, this is something that there's so much mystery around it, and yet to the people of the time there may not have been any mystery about it whatsoever. The main problem is that the traditions related to the Sheila-na-gigs were kept very much amongst the common folk, and by the time records were made of them in the mid-1800s, they had been more or less driven underground. When the first researchers came across Sheila-na-gigs, their initial line of investigation into their meaning was to inquire about those rural traditions from the locals, but they do not appear to have gained much that would explain them. Anderson suggested that these Victorian researchers were, quote, gripped with near apoplexy at the sight of them, unquote, and voiced his disappointment that the earlier researchers did not direct more research towards the subject. For the latter part of the 19th century, speculation about the Sheila-na-gigs predominated over investigation, and it was not until Edith Guest and her colleagues started to spend time among the rural people that a picture started to emerge about how they regarded them, and we quoted that earlier. It has been argued that the belief in the Sheila-na-gigs being the image of a saint is merely a recently applied interpretation to explain away their existence, and as such is of little direct relevance. There is a good deal of evidence, however, that a saintly figure is envisioned by people of former times appears to have appeared quite dramatically from how it is usually imagined in the modern day. The figure at Douth, and there used to be a Sheila-na-gig at Douth on the wall of the old church there, which was unfortunately defaced sometime in the 20th century, I think, at the time John Boyle O'Reilly had passed away, when they were making the memorial for him there. I think that's when it probably happened. The figure at Douth was known in earlier times as an image of Saint Sheelah, a dual gender name meaning wise one, and in the west gable of the old church of Sir Kieran, another important Sheila-na-gig was regarded as an image of its founding saint Kieran, which may bring into question the true gender of this presumed male saint. Two of the most important examples of Sheila-na-gigs that were regarded as saintly figures are the figure at Ballyvorney in County Cork and Killinaboy in County Clare. Traditions were, until very recent times, very similar at both sites, and there is evidence to suggest a direct connection between them. I'm not going to read any more, because I want you to go and find out all of this for yourselves. Okay, I will. I'll read one more. Like Gobnat at Ballyvorney, Ingin Buiha was also the daughter of a druid, specifically the daughter of Boa, B-O-A-T-H. Ingin Buiha is also closely related to the magic cow, Glas Govnach, which also features in the traditions related to other important saints such as Kieran of Sir Kieran. The name Boath and the relationship to the Glas Govnach, or the Glas Govni, or the Glas Gaunach, it's got many spellings and probably pronunciations, strongly suggest a connection to the ancient cow goddess Boan, after whom the sacred Brunabonia is named. And that is a very interesting time for us to discuss, to just wheel back a little bit in the discussion and to consider two things: the link with the equinox, and then the link with pagan or pre-Christian mythology. So the first one, in terms of the equinox, is very interesting because the tradition of St. Patrick, of course, is that he landed at Inverculpa, travelled to Slane, up the Boyne River. He was basically following the direction of the equinox sun and arrived on the hill of Slane on Easter Saturday, the 25th of March in 433 AD. And of course, Aaron Durrett points out that the Glasgoblin is also Bridget's cow, so there you go. And she's milking the cow, isn't she, on St. Michael's Tower on Glastonbury Tor as well. Of course, she's got connections with Glastonbury. She's said to have lived there for a while in a place that's now called Beckery, which is apparently an anglicisation of the Irish Beag era, meaning small Ireland. But Patrick was basically following the equinox sun, and of course the celebration of Easter is entirely tied in with the vernal equinox. It is celebrated, or in pre-Christian times it was celebrated on the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Now in the modern Catholic Church, celebrated on the first Sunday following the first full moon following the vernal equinox. Interestingly also is the idea of Patrick and Sheila, perhaps. Let's just widen the discussion here and the possibilities. And this is just speculation, of course, but we're just conversing and we're just exploring ideas. That perhaps St. Patrick was a later iteration of an earlier deity, like Lu, like Nuadu, like Dagda, a solar deity, that Patrick's banishment of the snakes can be seen, as we discussed yesterday, as a possible continuation or a new version of, or a Christianized version of, the mythology of the Dagda, the sun deity, defeating the great serpent of the Mata at Brunabonia, dismembering it and throwing its pieces into the Boyne and causing the floodwaters of Magmurhevna to recede and for the surface land to appear. And perhaps this is just one of the many reiterations of a very, very ancient creation myth in which the sun deity is seen to overwhelm the prehistoric serpent or giant monster. However, there is also a clear connection here between Bowen and the story of Mata and the dismemberment, because she is also dismembered in forming the River Boyne in this great releasing of the waters caused by her illicit approach and illicit circling of the well of Segish, or Nectan's well, which was a male-dominated domain. And what I'm thinking here is that Bowen, who I've connected in my own work with the river and the moon, as well as being an earth and fertility goddess, is perhaps represented in an ancient Sheela-na-gig in the form of the very organic structure that is Newgrange, Sheedan Broga. It being representative or symbolic of the pregnant earth, the swollen belly of the pregnant earth, its entrance being representative of the vulva, and its passage and chamber being representative of the sacred divine womb or uterus. And in such case, we can call it the passage womb of Newgrange rather than the passage tomb. And this is something that I got a chance to discuss with Emer Stassin on our lovely discussion yesterday on St. Patrick's Day. Again, we can link that in afterwards. Dismemberment of Mother Earth, Emer is asking, and Margaret is talking about the suppression of the Kundalini. Of course, yes, because the serpent could be representation of feminine divine energy, of course. Now, just to extend out that thought process, right? What if Sheila, as seems to be suggested by Jack Roberts, is a fairly modern continuation of something that's really, really ancient? That there has to have been this balance. That this balance is something that perhaps was lost when the patriarchal church really took root. And I believe that happened actually not with the arrival of Patrick, and my knowledge of medieval Ireland is poor, so don't take my word on this. Go and research it for yourselves. The possibility that, I think that the real doctrinal Catholicism, I think, came with the large religious orders who established the great monasteries, so the Cistercians, etc. The early Irish church, I think, we discussed this yesterday, and this is perhaps something we can devote an entire episode to in the future. The early Irish church incorporated some of the pre-Christian traditions and rites and rituals into it, and perhaps even some of its personages. So here we have possibly with Sheila, we have a continuation of a very ancient feminine deity, Cailleach Bui, who is interred at Nouth. The monument said to have been built over her, Nouth, commemorating two goddesses according to the Dinshanachus, one of whom is Bui, identified by some scholars as Cailleach Bui, another version of the Cailleach, and Englec, the daughter of Elkmar. And in Bui we see literally another emanation or another iteration of the goddess of Bowen. What does Bowen mean? It means bright cow or illuminated cow. The connection between the cow and the river, which I wasn't perhaps able to articulate fully when I first published Island of the Setting Sun in 2006, I was able to articulate very nicely yesterday in the interview with Emer. I'm actually going to post that in right now because I think you will want to watch that afterwards. What was I saying? Yes, the river and the moon. Here's the connection. At what point do you think the prehistoric, the Neolithic culture who brought farming to Ireland and who constructed the great monuments of Brunabonia, Newgrange, Nouth and Douth, Sheedenbroga, Knogba and Duad. At what point do you think they made the connection, using the river as they did, the Boyne, as their access route to the monuments from the sea? At what point had they realised that the moon controlled the tides? In fact, I think that this is something that had been known since time immemorial, and it wasn't new knowledge in the Neolithic. It was very, very ancient knowledge. Still sacred, of course, but very ancient knowledge. And that, in fact, we find when we do the research of the archaeological work and the geological and the anthropological work of the great late Professor Frank Mitchell, who lived close to Drogheda here at Townley Hall, and who was the inspiration for generations of archaeologists who came afterwards, including George Ogan, that Professor Mitchell found that in fact in prehistory the Boyne River was tidal all the way up to the end of the bend of the Boyne, where the Boyne turns westwards after its northerly journey just underneath Nouth, and it turns westwards towards Slane, that in fact the river was tidal. Now, if you were carrying giant curbstones, which the archaeologists tell us were strapped to the underneath of barges, and you were bringing them down the sea and up the river, you would probably need to know when the high tide was, and that was connected with the moon. And of course, one of my chapters in Island of the Setting Sun is called Newgrange, Womb of the Moon, because brew is a word that means womb, and Bowen can be connected with the moon. So I'm also thinking here solar and lunar agencies, as well as solar and Earth Mother agencies, and riverine as well. And so the mythological archetypes that we see with, for instance, the mating of Dagda and Bowen to create the miracle child Aengus Og, is continued with the story of how Dechtine has a dream at Sheedenbroga in which Lu, another solar agency or solar deity, tells her that she is going to have a child, and that child will be Setanta, a continuation of the same thing. I'm not suggesting for a second that Patrick and Sheila had any children, because there's nothing at the moment to suggest that. What I'm suggesting is that some of Patrick's story is a continuation of some of these pre-Christian pagan myths, and that perhaps and more than likely the story of Sheila is likewise derived from something pre-Christian. Oh, what a can of worms we have opened up this evening. So, for instance, there are places in Ireland where you can go and where you can see a stone at an ancient site, and you're told that they're the footprints of Fionn McCool, or they're the knee prints of Fionn McCool. Or this is a standing stone that was thrown here by Fionn McCool from Tara or from some other location, usually a sacred location, of course. And then someone else will tell you, no, they're the footsteps of St. Patrick. And for instance, there's a stone here in Drogheda on the road at Mel, just outside the town, heading out towards a place called Waterunder, that is called Clough-Patrick, very close to St. Patrick's Well there. And Clough-Patrick is the place where Patrick is said to have walked into the town, either on his way to Slane or on his way back from Slane, one or the other, and to have preached Christianity to the townspeople, and to have converted a lot of them and baptized them there. And indeed, on that stone is a hole that is said to be his footprint where he stood, or his footprints where he stood and preached to the people. Now, the fact that there is a conflation in the folklore between the footprints or the knee prints of Patrick and Fionn McCool, to me, says an awful lot. What it suggests to me is that one was literally being taken over by the other. And so we also discussed the Bridget's Way alignment yesterday. This alignment of sites connecting the place where Bridget was born to the place where she founded her monastery, which lines up some very prehistoric places, including Duan O'Neill, the Mound of the Hostages on Tara, and Dua Slania, the Mound of Slania on the Hill of Slane. So in other words, while this alignment may be connected in our minds with a a Christian saint. Undoubtedly, there's a pre-Christian mythology and belief underlying that. In the same way as Patrick follows this alignment from Inverculpa to Slane, and this Millmount Slane alignment with the sunset actually follows all the way west to Cruachan Aigla, which is Croagh Patrick. And what happens at Cruachan Aigla? According to the legend, what happens is that Patrick, in some accounts, is assaulted or attacked by serpents or snakes. In some accounts, demon birds. And of course, in the famous account that I really love, the Corra, which is in some accounts connected with or identified with the Ulfest, which is another version of the Mata, the giant serpent who licked up all of the water from the Boyne River until it was a dry river valley, until the sun god came along and clubbed him with his club and made the water recede. Or in some accounts, the men of Ireland hacked at the monster, chopped it to pieces, dismembered it, and threw its bits into the River Boyne, and they floated off and formed other landscape features. The fact that Patrick banished the snakes into the sea is very interesting, because there we have the riverine connection again. What happens to Boyne? When she forms the Boyne and it chases her all the way down, she loses an eye, she loses a hand, and she loses a leg, and parts of the Boyne are called the leg and the arm of the wife of Nuadu, and she's washed out to sea and drowned, and her dog with her, Dabilla the hound, or the lapdog. And so we're seeing the same sort of theme, but it's very difficult perhaps to connect immediately the idea of this giant serpent and the idea of a female deity or a female agency. I think that we have room here to reconsider the resuscitation of Sheila. And perhaps it is a case that in the future more sources about her will come to light, thanks to the initial work of Shane Lahan 2 or 3 years ago that was highlighted by the Irish Times, and which led to a proliferation of stories about Sheila. And that's suddenly, at a time when lots of very ancient things are being brought to the surface. They're not new, but they're being renewed. It is very interesting that a long-lost tradition of Sheila, thought to have died out with the famine, is being resuscitated. And one of the things that Jung, and I mentioned it there, Carl Jung believed that for the rehabilitation of modern man, and we should really talk about modern humans, because we're talking about men and women, that it was very important that the divine feminine be resuscitated and reinstated. And in fact, in his work, Answer to Job, which is a very interesting book, a short book, won't take you long to read, he discusses some of the symbolism of Revelation, the revelation of St. John the Divine, and the fact that the female figure who is seen to arise after all of the horrible and great things that happen in Revelation is very much, as he describes her, like a pre-Christian or a pagan female deity. The one with the crown of 12 stars is seated on a great throne. I think that's the one he talks about. But anyway, I think it's desperately needed. I don't know about the rest of you. Certainly all the women who are watching are agreeing. I've seen that. They're agreeing that it's time for the revival of the feminine deities. Absolutely it is, of course. Margaret Ring says, the moon is also the womb's same 28-day fertility from period to period. Well, that's very interesting, because in addition to that, in addition to the fact that the lunar cycles are connected with the menses, is the fact that the lunar synodic months, 9 of them, are connected with the gestation period of human birth. The 9 months referred to in the myth of Dagda and Bowen basically copulating at Newgrange, which says that the Dagda cast a spell making time dilate. Excuse that phrase, dilation, in relation to this discussion. I'm sorry. The expansion or the dilation of time was that Elkmar would think he was only away for 1 day, when in fact he was away for 9 months, enough time for the child Angus to be conceived and born and hidden away. and thus Aengus Og gets his name as a result of the fact that young is the son that was conceived at the beginning of the day and born between that and the evening time. Aaron Durrett is asking, sorry, who wrote Answer to Job? That would be C.G. Jung, and I will fetch a copy of it momentarily if you give me a second. Now, this is the strangest book cover you will ever see, and I don't get it, and maybe I'll have to reread it. It's a cheese grater. Jung, Answer to Job. And there's a very, very interesting, and perhaps I have a lot of highlighted passages in here. Perhaps I will be able to quickly find the one where I was referring to this feminine deity that arises, at the end of the apocalypse, that appears to have sort of pre-Christian, or what would you call it, a pagan sort of identity. I'm trying to find it, desperately trying to find it here quickly for you, so that we don't drag it out too long. Yeah, here's one paragraph that may be relevant. Kieran Campbell is watching. Hi Kieran, very welcome. Sinead Deneen is also watching. Hello Sinead, you're very welcome. This parallelism, which has so far, I haven't been on the whiskey yet in honour of Saint Sheelah, but I will have one, which so far remained latent in John, now bursts into consciousness in the form of a vision. That this invasion is authentic can be seen from the use of pagan mythological material, a most improbable procedure for a Christian of that time, especially as it contains traces of astrological influence. That may explain the thoroughly pagan remark, quote, and the earth helped the woman, unquote. Yeah, I have no idea what the cheese grater is about. It's a funny one, Even though the consciousness of that age was exclusively filled with Christian ideas, earlier or contemporaneous pagan contents lay just below the surface, as, for example, in the case of Saint Perpetua. With a Judeo-Christian, and the author of the Apocalypse was probably such, another possible model to be considered is the cosmic Sophia, to whom John refers on more than one occasion. She could easily be taken as the mother of the divine child, the very same Bowen that we've just been talking about, mother of Aengus, since she is obviously a woman in heaven, i.e. a goddess or consort of a god. Sophia comes up to this definition, and so does the transfigured Mary. If the vision were a modern dream, one would not hesitate to interpret the birth of the divine child as the coming to consciousness of the self. In John's case, the conscious attitude of faith made it possible for the Christ image to be received into the material of the unconscious. It activated the archetype of the Divine Virgin, Mother, and of the birth of her son-lover, and brought it face to face with his Christian consciousness. As a result, John became personally involved in the divine drama. Just trying to find it. Is there another, very quickly, if there's another reference to this woman. Of course, I wasn't planning to read from Jung, which is why I hadn't got this material ready. Perhaps this is something we should continue in another discussion, but undoubtedly it'll come up again. Anyway, that is a highly recommended work that is not that far removed from mythology. Why Jung tries to answer why it is, I know this is a sudden different discussion, why it is that God was so ready to punish Job, who was a righteous and clean living man. And he has very interesting conclusions, which I'm not going to spoil for you. Karen Smith says the cycle or wheel of life, the Cailleach, and of course, yeah, absolutely, because she's also associated with the harvest. The last crop of wheat, wasn't it, or barley from the harvest, was made into this shape and kept in a house. It almost had an anthropomorphic, a human-like shape, was called the Cailleach, Pour me another tequila, Sheila. That's a song, says Margaret. Well, if you teach me how to sing it, perhaps I'll give you a few verses, but not tonight. Why all this was taken by the church is beyond me. Well, look, I said it yesterday morning in the interview with Emer. I don't think it serves any of us who are interested in Irish mythology and perhaps the rehabilitation or the revitalisation of ancient beliefs and myths. I don't think it serves us very well to try to denigrate the church. A lot of people on my posts, anytime I talk about St. Patrick on my Facebook page, people always say that, Christianity destroyed paganism, destroyed pre-Christian religion, destroyed Irish mythology. It didn't, and that's a fact. Now, the later church suppressed a lot of stuff, absolutely. But let me tell you one thing that definitely did not happen, was that there wasn't a banishment of belief. There wasn't a castigation of it. It was incorporated into Christianity. Christian sites are often, holy places are often built in conjunction with prehistoric, pre-Christian pagan ones. They're not destroyed. The pre-Christian ruins on the Hill of Slane are still there. The pre-Christian ruins on the Hill of Tara are still there. In fact, greater damage was done to Rana Shanad, the Wrath of the Synods, by the bloody British Israelites, a mob of lunatics, than was by the church at any time. However, I agree that the female divine agency was definitely suppressed by a patriarchal church. There cannot be any doubt about that. But look, here we have a chance to do something constructive about it, not to be negative in our views. You should not confront this or approach it in any way with a meanness in mind or any sort of a denigratory attitude, because if you do, the problem is that you will get a negative reaction to that. You cannot start, if you want to, and I'm not starting a movement, I'm just saying, if you wanted to try to reinstate that feminine agency in her various forms, whether they be Bowen, the Cailleach, Sheila, Sheila-na-gig, whatever, then it does not serve you very well to start from the point of denigrating the patriarchal church. It definitely doesn't do you any good. Get away from that attitude and come from a place of wholeness. And something else that I said to Emer in my interview yesterday that I should reiterate is that my own Catholic and Christian upbringing served me in many respects. Regardless of what I think about it now, and regardless of the fact that I now consider myself an agnostic, I would very much take the attitude expounded by the likes of John O'Donoghue, an ex-priest who went on to talk a lot about pre-Christian Irish beliefs. And, for instance, the likes of Sean O'Dynn, the late Sean O'Dynn, the monk from Glenstall Abbey, who was known to his peers as the Druid, who took a similar view that there's room for everything, in the whole approach. Anyway, I will take questions if there are any, and if there aren't any, we'll say good luck and goodbye and happy Sheila's Day and all the rest. And I'll go and pour myself a small glass of Bushmills, which I will raise in her honour. And I will say to her, if I thought she was listening, that we need your help right now. We're in a very difficult phase. We're in a very, very difficult time. And perhaps that patriarchal pig-headedness that has brought us all of the difficulties that are associated with the collapse of the church and the collapse of the political establishment and perhaps the collapse of the economic establishment definitely need to reflect now and to reconsider bringing the divine feminine back into the fold as an equal, Erin says, I'm a progressive Christian and a Buddhist and a devout lover of all mythology. Well, that's the way I see it. I don't think that you can denigrate anything. You have to consider all things, Karen says, the Cailleach is the goddess, is the womb ever present, correct? And without her fertile gifts, then we are nothing. And that is true. Freya says, such a treat as usual, thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long there, because I was reading the material, which is fine, but then I sort of got excited and got carried away on other matters. I'm still looking for topics for discussion. I have loads and loads and loads. So coming this week, we're going to get back to Bowen, because I want to talk to you about Bowen, especially from the point of view of the material in the Dinshenicus. I am waiting on the delivery of a couple of volumes of the Dinshenicus, because up to now I've only had them in electronic form, and I want to have the actual physical books. Perhaps that's become disrupted by the COVID-19 situation, so I don't know when they'll arrive. Hopefully in the next couple of days. Some suggestions. Oh yeah, let's read the suggestions, but perhaps you could add to this list. One of the suggestions that came up this evening was to read The Children of Lear. One of the suggestions was that we read the story of, oh yeah, better actually write that down, Deirdre and the Sons of Uisneach. Okay. Other suggestions, Queen Maeve, Finn, although Fionn McCool, we would probably have to take one or two particular aspects of that. In that regard, one of the suggestions was, and I think that came up in the Battle of Moytura, was that we discuss the Battle of Ventry, the Battle of the White Strand, and the Tuatha Dé Danann are involved there. I'll take a note of that while I'm talking. Somebody else wants us. Maureen O'Leary suggested we talk about Scota. Now, we will talk about Scota. I don't think that one will be too long because the references to her are thin on the ground in Laura Gawala. And I may get on to talking about dissecting the fake news around Scota, shall we say. The sort of stuff that's propagated about her that may not be true. Somebody else suggested the Morrigu or the Morrigan or the Morrigan, who comes in various various name spellings, and that was suggested by Esther Guggisberg, who's a regular viewer. Somebody else wants us to talk about Bridget, so a lot of feminine deities being suggested. Maeve Fianna Callahan suggested we talk about the Cailleach, so perhaps we could lengthen out some of the discussion this evening into a discussion about the Cailleach, and then the Children of Lear and Deirdre and the Sons of Uisneach. There's so much we could talk about. Anyway, Macha and horses in Celtic mythology. Interesting. Okay, I'll put that in as a topic, and that's suggested by Sheila Murphy Weekly. In Celtic, no, not, she doesn't suggest it weekly, her name is Weekly. Joke, terrible joke, I know, sorry. That's suggested by, I want to keep a note of who suggests these things as well, so I can mention them when I eventually get round to talking about them. That's a very good suggestion, Sheila. Margaret Ring, Anya, the fairy queen of Munster. Oh yes, yes, Anya. There's an Anya up here too. Dún Anya, Dunaney in County Louth. We will talk about Anya, the fairy queen of Munster. And that's suggested by my good friend Margaret Ring. Excellent, Margaret. Good stuff. Yes, Aaron says, so great to hear everybody's voices. The reason I like doing it on Facebook is because we can have that interaction. People can make comments and ask questions. And it saves me going off on a total rant or a total being totally distracted by significant diversions from the path, and sometimes I forget to go back onto the path again. I hope you enjoyed that. Sheila, or Saint Sheelah if you prefer, definitely not a Catholic saint. It has been pointed out to me. And I should probably add that I, at no point do I mean to cause anybody any offence. But I know that some people sort of are not at all happy about the suggestion that Sheila is a saint. But she was a vernacular saint, and of course Ireland is full of them. There are saints in every townland in Ireland, and there are local legends and local folklore about local saints everywhere you go. You know, whether those were real saints or not, that's up to you to debate. I'm not going to debate it. And as usual, don't forget that the video will be available immediately afterwards if you want to recount, and I will upload it to the YouTube channel, which can be found at Mythical Ireland, or youtube.com/Mythical Ireland. I should also mention, give a very brief plug to the fact that if you would like to support my work, I would be very glad if you considered making a donation. This is not a begging letter. A one-off donation can be made through my website, through PayPal, and I will paste that link in immediately below right now as a comment. There you go. And if not, if you want to become a more regular contributor, you could consider becoming a patron of Mythical Ireland over at patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. that is a nice one because you get rewards for your patronage, which increase as the amount increases. So there's a few videos and there's a podcast available only to my patrons at the moment that may or may not be released to the general public later on. So have a look at that if you like. In the meantime, Red Moonhead is intrigued by the mysterious orb to my side. I don't see that. That's interesting. Where are you seeing that? I'm not seeing any orb. Hopefully it's, well, it's probably just a reflection, isn't it, from the camera, but maybe not. Karen, the Keeper of the Wells. Well, Bowen would fit in there, but perhaps there's a wider theme to be discussed there. A portal to the future. Well, who knows? In the meantime, have a very good evening. Stay safe. If you have to stay indoors, stay indoors. This is episode 7. All of those are available. All of the previous episodes are available in one place on the blog at mythicalireland.com. Again, I'll paste that in as I'm talking to you here. I will upload this one. And we'll catch up again tomorrow. I don't quite know what the theme for tomorrow is, but we'll think of something. Patrick yesterday and Sheila today, so male and female done. Perhaps we'll do something that's a little bit more collective, like we might do the Children of Lyra or something tomorrow. In the meantime, have a very good evening. Don't forget to raise a glass to our good friend Sheila. Good night from Ireland.